Hello and welcome to number 115 of Mark Talks About All the Things He Owns. Today I'm going to be talking about someone that you have undoubtedly heard of. I did one episode about him way back in the midst of time, episode number 3 I think it was, where I talked about counterfeit Japanese and Chinese box sets of his releases. I'm going to talk through all of the albums and the career of Sir David Bowie, the Beckenham Oddity, presenting here his debut album in picture disc format that was released very recently, which is actually the first time I've owned this album on vinyl. Now I did some googling, I did some frantic searching. There are 13 podcasts about David Bowie, and me seeing a huge kind of gap in the market, I decided what the world needed more of was a middle-aged bloke talking about a dead singer's albums from 50 years ago, because there certainly aren't enough of those. And at some point, someone is somewhere is almost inevitably at any given moment in time recording a podcast about the Beatles, and I don't want to let down Sir David Bowie either. So at some point, someone is always listening to, thinking about, talking about, blogging about, tweeting about this guy, and I figured this afternoon was my turn. Now, this was released in June 1967, which is bizarre to think that it's older than I am. Let's not say how much older than I am, but this record is now, I think, 54 years old, and it's a very strange experience to listen to David Bowie's early years and to understand kind of where he got to and how he got to. The one thing that's very clear is he started off at a very young age. He was very keen. He worked very hard to be a success in whatever chosen field that he was going to work in. He had a love of mime. He did mime work, acting work, singing work. He certainly probably wasn't destined for a life working at the local bank as a bank manager for the Bromley branch of Lloyd's or HSBC. Now, there's a quite complicated discography, actually, to start off with David Bowie. The early years of his life, the early records that he made, he was living single to single, album to album, song to song, with no clear overarching path around what he was going to do. He just worked really bloody hard to try and be a success in some form, and was prepared to latch himself onto, dedicate himself to, and if it didn't work, jettison other musicians. And that's probably a trend which carried on throughout the whole of his career. But I'm going to talk about the most easily available of his early singles and records, give you a guided tour through them because it's quite complicated, and give you some hints and tidbits on the way. So when we start off with, I've listened to these albums a lot, the early records that he made, the 1967 debut, and also the early singles, and I must admit, these singles probably would have disappeared without a trace had it not been for what David had done later. He probably would have been, rediscovered probably about 5 or 6 years ago, at the anniversary of his death, where someone would have said, "Oh yeah, did you know this guy who died that we've hardly ever heard of?" And some guy that acted in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and Into the Night, and Labyrinth. He made a couple of albums in the early 60s before he became famous. And listen to these, and then there'd be reissued as curios in double CD box sets, probably on Cherry Red. Now there's many ways in which you can get these songs, but they are not readily available. So the early songs before his first album are not easy to find these days at all, unless you have access to YouTube. There's been, for many decades, David Bowie was not particularly interested in that stuff. It was juvenilia for him, I suppose, and it lapsed in and out of print. It went on different numbers of labels. It came out in a number of configurations. It was easily available, then it was incredibly obscure. Songs fell in and out. Some songs have been available on one CD and then never seen again, or deliberately withdrawn from the market because I think he either didn't like them or he wasn't interested in them. But slowly over time, I think he seemed to have scooped up the copyright for a lot of these early singles, and they have slowly dropped out of circulation. I'm sure at some point somebody will do a remastered box set of his early work. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, because there is a box set of David Bowie's released approximately every 2 weeks, and it's been at least 2 weeks since the last one. So his career started off in 1964. 6th of June 1964 was his first single release, and it's not on here, by the way, but his first single release, like a lot of his early material, is now really only available on this CD, David Bowie's Early On, 1964 to 1966. This was released by Rhino Records in 1991. And if you want to get all the early David Bowie material before his first album, this is easily the place to go to get almost all of it. There are 17 songs on here. The A's and B's of his first few singles, and 3 songs which hadn't been previously released, which his then manager had copies of, which were then allowed onto here, which apparently David wasn't very pleased about. So this is the early stuff, really. This is quite hard to find. I think it's, depending on how patient you are and where you want to look, you can get the CD secondhand for between £10 and £20. I paid £11.99 on eBay for this. The lowest price at the moment on Discogs is about £30. It's definitely not worth £30, by the way. What this is the sound of a 17-year-old boy in South London who desperately wants to be in a successful band and is prepared to go to some length to achieve that. And he moves between various styles, various types of songs, and sometimes you listen to it and go, is that really David Bowie? Because it doesn't really sound like it. And you can clearly tell that he's been listening to a lot of the Beatles as well. There's cover versions on here. Now, I have to remember the world that happened at this point, which I barely remember, but I was born the day that he split up the Spiders from Mars at Hammersmith, and so I dimly remember this. And he was born about the time of my parents, so listening to early David Bowie, it's kind of like an insight into what my parents might have been like when they were 17 or 18, listening to cheaply recorded, tinny, loud garage rock, and it was a pretty grim time. Almost everything was prefabs. Brutalism was practically a national sport. Architecture, they were tearing everything down and replacing it with flats and tower blocks in the new gold dream. All the world was changing. Britain was 10 years out of rationing at this point. Hitler had been defeated only 20 years previously. It was all very, very modern history. It was a very unusual world. Elvis had been famous maybe 6 or 7 years. The Beatles had been famous maybe 2 or 3 years by the time that the first single by David Bowie came out. People were going into the record shops and they were buying import 7-inch singles from America, learning them and playing them. And it was a very interesting embryonic time in British rock culture. And there was no eye on, well, what's the world going to look like in 50 years' time? No one cared about that. We were all going to be blown up by the Russians in a nuclear explosion at some point anyway. So live for today and worry about tomorrow later. Now, the first single is called Liza Jane. It was released, I think, as I've said, on the 6th of June 1964. Now, the most readily available place you can get Liza Jane, and in fact all of his A-sides, is on the triple disc version of Nothing Has Changed, which was published in 2014. So it's got the A-sides of Liza Jane, the second single, You've Got a Habit of Leaving, the third single, David Bowie with the lower third, Can't Help Thinking About Me, Silly Boy Blue, In the Heat of the Morning. So it's got 5 really early singles. Now this is arranged perhaps somewhat perversely in a reverse chronological order. So it opens with Sue or In a Season of Crime from his last album, his final album in his lifetime, Black Star. And then it goes through 3 CDs and through 59 songs all the way through to Liza Jane. So the last song on this fantastic 3 CD set, by the way, is Liza Jane. And the cover art, as you'll see all the way through, is David looking in a mirror. Here's a shot from the man who fell to earth. Can't recall when that is, probably around about the same time. Here's the Ziggy Stardust era, and there's another photograph as well, and that, and there, again, another shot of him looking in a mirror. It's clearly, a reflection upon that, and it takes its lyric from the track Sunday, which opens with where David talks about how nothing has changed and everything has changed at the same time. This is a fantastic career retrospective of David Bowie, and you should buy it or listen to it if you have an interest in him. If you don't, it will be a colossal waste of time. So The early A-sides are all collected on here, and they're back in print, and this is the easiest place to get them, is the 3 CD version. But if you want the B-sides as well, and frankly, if you need to understand the full career of David Bowie, you need to know the B-sides and the other tracks as well. Then you need David Bowie's early on 1964 to 1966 CD that was released by Rhino in 1991. And this was probably inspired by the Ryko disc reissue program that David ran in 1990, when he put out in remastered form with bonus tracks almost all of his studio albums between 1969 and up to, I think, Scary Monsters in 1980. When I talk about those albums, I will talk about the Ryko disc reissues, but there's lots and lots of tracks that are only on the Ryko disc reissues, which were deleted sometime in the mid-90s and haven't really been available since then. Early on is absolutely the place to go. And the first single, as I've mentioned before, was Liza Jane, backed with Louie Louie Go Home. And Liza Jane was re-recorded, like a lot of David Bowie songs, for an unreleased David Bowie album, which was recorded in the year 2000. It is called Toy. Here is a bootleg edition of Toy on vinyl that contains re-recordings of Liza Jane and Silly Boy Blue, In the Heat of the Morning, The London Boys, Shadow Man, a previously unreleased song from 1970 called Hole in the Ground, I Dig Everything, and Let Me Sleep Beside You. There are also a number of other songs that were recorded for the album which haven't yet circulated or were issued on B-sides in 2002. And... oh, no, that's not going to work. And I forgot to bring this out as well. David Bowie's VH1 Storytellers, which was recorded in 1999, which features his then live band performing Can't Help Thinking About Me for the first time in about 30 years. So in 1999-2000, on the cusp of the millennia, David, I think, was probably feeling quite nostalgic, and he went back and revisited a lot of the songs which I'm going to be talking about now, re-recorded them, rewrote them, represented them so that they sounded perhaps less scrappy and more finalised and more finished, because I think he saw worth in the songs and thought that they were worth more than just being forgotten about from 30 years previously. So the first single, it's great, competent, bangy 60s kind of rock, very clearly influenced by the Beatles. And if you like the Beatles, more rambunctious earlier stuff like Love, Love Me Do and Can't Buy Me Love and all that, then you'll love Liza Jane. But I listen to it and I go, it doesn't sound like David Bowie singing. It sounds like he's becoming himself. He's growing into who he is, and starting to cut away all the bits that didn't look like him until he found out who he really was. Now, the CD of early on features Liza Jane and Louie Louie Go Home. It also features the second single, which was recorded under the name of the Manish Boys, which was a track called I Pity the Fool, and the first David Bowie song ever published, Take My Tip, which sounds like a terribly smutty title. This is one of the most readily available versions of it. It's a 4-track EP. It was released as a 7-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch CD in the early 80s, late 80s as well. This is the 10-inch version of it, featuring I Pity the Fool and Take My Tip, which is copyright 1965 by the Manish Boys. And then the second side has the second single, You've Got a Habit of Leaving and Baby Loves That Way. Now, the versions of Take My Tip and I think Baby Loves That Way on this have a different alternate vocal take to the versions that are on the single, because why make life easy when you can make life hard? And that's how it is. So obviously you have to go and find a copy of this EP if you want all of the David Bowie recordings. As I said, the CD version is available and was released in 1989, but hasn't been reissued since then. They have to find a 30-year-old CD or merely a 28-year-old CD. No, actually, this is 30 years now. Yeah, you have to find a 30-year-old CD. I've forgotten it was 2021 because we are on day 428 of lockdown. All the years and the months, the weeks, the days, the hours all kind of merge into one amorphous mass of me sitting at home talking to my mobile phone about records from my record collection. Now, the interesting thing is I Pity the Fool has Jimmy Page on rhythm guitar. When Jimmy Page was doing session musician work, he'd play for anybody that paid him money. So this, you've got Jimmy Page and David Bowie playing on the same song at the same time. So he was playing rhythm guitar before he joined Led Zeppelin. He was in the Yardbirds. I think he's in a film called, I think it's Blow Up, I think, as well, playing guitar in one of the club scenes. He's also on this single, which is pretty strange, and you thought people would advertise David Bowie and Jimmy Page in their early years a bit more, but they didn't. You've Got a Habit of Leaving and Baby Loves That Way, which are the third single, released by Davy Jones and the Lower Third. Both of those tracks were re-recorded for the Toy album in 2001, which I've mentioned down there and we'll come back to later on. And we're also, I think, You've Got a Habit of Leaving was released on the B-side of a single called Slow Burn in 2002, and Baby Loves That Way, I think, was also the B-side of a single called Everyone Says Hi. Now, that takes us up to the third single, so we've got Liza Jane, I Pity the Fool, and You've Got a Habit of Leaving. And then we go on to the fourth single, when David Bowie was recording on Poly Records. Here's a very popular 10-inch EP that was released around, by the looks of it, around about 1978, called Don't Be Fooled by the Name. This was, for a long time, the easiest way to get hold of singles 4, 5 and 6 of David Bowie's career. Again, a 10-inch, again, a very garish label, featuring I'm Not Losing Sleep, I Dig Everything, Can't Help Thinking About Me, and then on the B-side, Do Anything You Say, Good Morning Girl, and I Say to Myself. Obviously, copies of this are quite affordable. They sold lots of them at the time, and you can still find copies around quite easily and quite affordably if you want them. It's not to say they're any good particularly. They absolutely aren't. Can't Help Thinking About Me was re-recorded for the Toy album in the year 2000, and also on the VH1 Storytellers show. It was backed with, originally, And I Say to Myself. Now, on the 1st of April 1966, he released Do Anything You Say, backed with Good Morning Girl. And then on the 19th of August 66, he released I Dig Everything and I'm Not Losing Sleep. Around about this time, he was in yet another band. I think they were called The Buzz, and The Buzz had, if I remember correctly, a guitarist called John Hutchinson, who played with David for a very long period of time and appears on a number of his other releases. Also, I think John played in a rhythm guitar on some later period Spiders from Mars shows. I could be completely wrong, wouldn't be the first time. They're all covered on Early On, and they're presented in a sequential order. So there are 3 unreleased songs on Early On which weren't released until this CD came out, and those songs are That's Where My Heart Is, I Want My Baby Back, and Bars of the County Jail. There's no reason why they didn't come out, apart from the fact they're not vastly commercial. They sound like album tracks as opposed to singles tracks, but they're pretty good, but they're not amazing. And after that, there was another single which was issued, which was called Rubber Band. I think it was backed with the London Boys, and Rubber Band first appeared on an album on this, which is Images, and although Rubber Band and so on didn't appear on this, so this is the A-sides, by the way, of David's first singles, plus a number of previously unheard songs. So there's plenty of material on there, probably his first 7 actually. But on the 2nd of December 1966, David Bowie released a single called Rubber Band, backed with the London Boys, and this is I've got it on this album, Images, 1966-1967, which contains almost all of the songs that are on the David Bowie debut, plus almost all of the songs that are on his various singles and compilation releases. It gets really, really complicated. Of course it does. Why wouldn't it? Nobody would want it to be easy at all. And his 7th single, although I should point out, by the way, the most readily available way of getting the Don't Be Fooled by the Name 10-inch is now on CD. It was released for Record Store Day in 2016, a 50th anniversary 6-track CD and 12-inch, I think, release, which is the same stuff as what's on Don't Be Fooled by the Name. obviously, just buy early on. It's an easier way of doing it, but if you don't have the time, inclination, or money, this is a good place to get it, or at least most of the material. After Rubber Band, though, came a horrific record, a record that you will undoubtedly have heard, The Laughing Gnome, backed with the Gospel According to Tony Day. The Laughing Gnome is dreadful and brilliant at the same time. And it was a taste of what's to come on the David Bowie LP. So what I'm going to say about The Laughing Gnome is, if you listen to it, by the way, there's a huge Velvet Underground influence on this. You listen to the guitar part, the dun 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 dun, you listen to that and it sounds like Waiting for the Man or White Light, White Heat. Although it probably came out just about the same time. David was clearly listening to the same things that the Velvet Underground were listening to. He was clearly listening to the Kinks, early Pink Floyd. In many ways, the first David Bowie LP, just David Bowie, was a precursor of a lot of the perhaps more odious parts of Britpop. The cheeky chappy core blimey knees up Mother Brown. Here's a song about such a civil servant. Core blimey, here's some horns. That kind of stuff. And it's all kind of in The Laughing Gnome and the Gospel According to Tony Day. And obviously it's splattered all over the David Bowie debut LP. As you can probably tell, I haven't taken the shrink wrap off this. I'm not one of these wankers that goes around and goes, oh, sniff that Virgin vinyl. Oh, isn't that nice? It's just I haven't had a chance to play it yet, so I'm going to at some point. So this is the David Bowie debut LP, the first album released under his own name, when I think he was 21 years old when this was released. And so the David Bowie LP has 14 songs on it, and what we're listening to when you're hearing this is the influence of a lot of other artists that are popular at the time. So if he's not kind of listening to and blatantly ripping off people like Syd Barrett and the Kinks, and I think there's Anthony Newley as well, there's also huge chunks of kind of like music hall in here. There's some very unusual production choices. It's quite affected, actually. It's quite pretentious in so much as David is writing about things he clearly has no experience of. There's not that much in the way of tangible, touchable, feelable life experience. So when people start writing songs in bands, sometimes they don't have anything to write about. Now that sounds really crazy. I mean, obviously, even you in the Sex Pistols, the thing you've got to write about is growing up in a shitty suburb in London and being dirt poor. Which, by the way, David was doing at the same time. But there's very little of that sense of a tortured artist that's absolutely broke in this record. Some of the songs, just thinking about some of the songs, Little Bombardier, for example, and things like Maids Bond Street and Please Mr. Gravedigger. Those are songs that, to me, feel like they're about abstract concepts. They're about things people have read in books, to quote Echo and the Bunnymen, as opposed to things that David had actually lived and experienced. He was writing or imagining himself in the position of somebody else, such as, a gravedigger, a bombardier, a guy that sells toys, someone that sells medals, for example, such as She's Got Medals. And there's some not great songs on here. Every time I listen to it and I think, is it going to get better this time? And the answer is, it's okay. It's pretty good, but it's nowhere near. It's not the worst David Bowie LP, because the worst David Bowie LP was released in 1984, but it's in probably my bottom 3, which means I prefer Tin Machine 1 and 2 over this. And yes, I will fight you about that. Please don't make me do it. I am quite tired. But if you want to argue with me that this is better than Tin Machine 1 or 2, then frankly you are wrong, and I'm going to have to get out a graph and a chalkboard and explain to it using science. Because this is David Bowie writing and singing about things he has no practical real life experience of. There are some very good songs on here, but they are arch songs. They are detached songs in the way that when Blur did, Colin Zeal and things like Yuko and Hero and all those type of things, they're writing about songs, and they're writing about experiences, they're writing about things that they don't know about, they're projecting, using their imagination. REM have done this as well with some songs. They're writing about characters as opposed to personal experience. But there's not enough personal experience in David Bowie's life at this point to make these songs really feel authentic. They feel like character studies or sketches, or perhaps if you watch a movie and someone says, what's the backstory behind, goon number 6 that gets shot in the face? And if the extra takes it really, really seriously, they'll tell you the entire story about how goon number 6 has, through a series of bad choices, found himself being goon number 6 in the background of a movie. But really, he's got a wife, he's got kids, he's struggling, he's got a cat that he loves, he's got council tax problems, he needs to get his roof fixed, or his radiators don't work. It's those kind of backstories. Those are the things that David Bowie's writing about on this LP. He's writing about things he hasn't experienced, but things he's imagined other people might experience. And of course, this is in no way a criticism of it. He's very good at it. It's just not that convincing, to be honest. You can kind of tell the difference between somebody who's seen it and knows it and lives it, as opposed to somebody that has experienced it or seen a documentary on Channel 5 around something, as opposed to having lived the actual event. There are things that I have only experienced through television. I wouldn't, for example, if I was going to write a song from the point of view of the guy that was the boss of the Chernobyl nuclear power station in 1986, I clearly don't have that lived experience. So if I was going to write a song about that, it wouldn't be as real, would it? I wouldn't have experience of that. Now, if I was going to write a song about the experiences that are common that us humans have all the time, although there are very few songs called Shit, I Missed the Bus. If I was going to write about things that I've experienced in real time, there'd be songs about, I love you, and I miss you, and I wish you'd come back, or I wish you'd never met me, or I wish you'd die in a car crash, or, songs like that. Lots of people have got experiences like that they can relate to, which is why some songs, such as, for example, REM's The One I Love, or songs like One by U2, they're very popular songs because they tap into common emotions that most human beings have felt at some point in their life. And when David Bowie strips away the artifice and the imagination around a song, and he writes about a common and universal human feeling, I think that's where a lot of us actually find real connection to his work. A lot of his work is absolutely fantastic, but half of it is completely unrelated to the real world that he's living in at all. Although quite how anybody would be interested in a concept album by a rock star who's isolated himself emotionally behind a great big whacking wall, calls himself Mr. Pink, and then writes songs about how his evil wife has cheated on him whilst... and it's like, no, I don't think anybody wants to hear that. Yeah, we want to hear about songs that we can whistle, songs that we can sing, and songs that we can relate to. And some of those songs are on here, but sometimes they're very blatant as well. Although it's not on here, by the way, it is on the 1970 reissue of the album called The World of David Bowie. There's 3 new songs that weren't released anywhere else. So The World of David Bowie has most of this album, plus 3 previously unreleased songs and some A and B single-only tracks. So, for example, Rubber Band, The London Boys, and then the unreleased songs are Let Me Sleep Beside You, Karma Man, and In the Heat of the Morning. And Let Me Sleep Beside You is a blatant attempt to rewrite the Rolling Stones' Let's Spend the Night Together, which, of course, I think David played live on some of his Spiders tours in the 70s. But this is a cheap budget price Decca K-Tel type reissue with a suspiciously Ziggy Stardust type cover that came out in 1970 after Space Oddity had been a hit. So this album, by the way, has, like all of David Bowie's albums, been reissued approximately 29,000 times in various configurations and forms. So, for example, we had the 2009 double CD edition here of the debut album. We also had most of the debut album that was on the Images compilation. This, by the way, if you're going to get a compilation of David Bowie A's and B's, this is a great place to start. Also, quite cheap to get. There's also a number of other releases, a number of crappy compilations with names like Another Face, Starting Point, The Secret Life of, those type of things. You don't need them all. Really what you need is this early on, and you need this, which is the 2 CD version of David Bowie, which was released in 2009. Also, by the way, you probably need to get Bowie at the Beeb, which has a number of radio sessions from early in his career. So let's say this album, not my favourite David Bowie album at all. But what you can see is he's becoming himself. He's learning how to write, how to be David Bowie, and he's starting to project himself into life experiences he hasn't had, but he's starting to write himself. There's also, by the way, a fantastic song on this called When I Live My Dream. Now, When I Live My Dream really sounds like something out of a musical that you haven't heard yet. So Andrew Lloyd Webber probably ripped off When I Live My Dream completely for all his drivel with Elaine Page in, but it's a great song and it's wasted on this album. It really, really is. This album's quite good, but someone said to me, in like 10 years' time, this guy's going to be making Low and Heroes, you'd be like, no way is he going to be that good. None of that David Bowie appears in here, which will probably get me kicking. But, there's 13 other podcasts that'll tell you that everything that David Bowie ever did was brilliant, and I'm not going to be that person. So, following on from that, after Space Oddity was a hit, there was The World of David Bowie, which, as I've mentioned before, is probably about half of the album, a number of single-only tracks, and 3 previously unreleased songs. And Let Me Sleep Beside You, Karma Man, and In the Heat of the Morning, by the way, on this were the first times that I think Tony Visconti worked with David Bowie, which were potentially recorded to go onto the second album, which David was going to record with D-Ram Records, but he and D-Ram separated, and he had to go and find himself a new record label. What we do have, though, this is pretty easy to find, is the Images 1966-1967 compilation that features a number of songs from the album and a number of other tracks, A's and B's. It's got the Laughing Gnome on it, which unsurprisingly is not on The World of David Bowie, and a lot of other songs as well. Now, the Laughing Gnome was reissued in 1974, and this is probably where this version comes from. I'm not a purist when it comes to these things. It was a bit hit, quite popular, sold quite well. So there's the second CD version, the 2 CD version of the David Bowie debut album. If you're going to buy a David Bowie album, the first one on CD, this is the version to get. It's got 2 versions of the album. It's got a mono version and it's got the stereo version. Now, there is a huge debate amongst Beatles fans in particular around which version is more authentic. Is it the mono mix or is it the stereo mix? The different overdubs of the mono version to the stereo version. The simple answer is I don't know, and I don't particularly care. Sorry, if that's the information that you're looking for, go onto the Steve Hoffman forums. They know far more about those things than I do. But you've got the mono version, which was the album here, and the stereo version, which is a different version for stereophonic cartridges. And it's also got, by the way, this verse 25 extra tracks on there. So it's got the A's and B's of all the singles. It's got the re-recording of Love You Till Tuesday, Did You Ever Have a Dream? It's got the 3 songs which are on The World of David Bowie. It's got the first release of London by Tatar on there as well. A previously unreleased version of In the Heat of the Morning. Unreleased mixes of Laughing Gnome, Gospel According to Tony Day, Did You Ever Have a Dream, Let Me Sleep Beside You, Karma Man. And it's got 4 songs which were recorded for BBC Radio 1's Top Gear session, which are not on here, by the way, not on Bowie at the Beeb, because those are Love You Till Tuesday, When I Live My Dream, Little Bombardier, Silly Boy Blue, and In the Heat of the Morning. And this has a number of other sessions from around about the same time, but they aren't exactly the same. So this has got a radio session with In the Heat of the Morning, London by Tatar, Karma Man, Silly Boy Blue, and Let Me Sleep Beside You, which are different to the radio session that's on here. So Bowie at the Beeb, by the way, in no way a comprehensive compilation of Bowie's early material, although absolutely essential if you want to hear alternate studio recordings of his songs between 1967 and about 1973. Naturally, this is the version with a third disc recorded in the year 2000. It's kind of surprising, actually, that they haven't done a Bowie at the BBC box set yet. There's certainly enough material for it. And if I'm going to be dropping any hints into the estate of David Bowie, they will sell anything with his name on. Do a David Bowie at the BBC multi-disc CD and DVD box set, guys. You know you want to, and you know I want to buy it. So that's the David Bowie LP. It's not the best LP he ever made. If you are going to think about, well, what am I going to have to buy in order to own it? Really, you need these two. You need Early On and the David Bowie double CD. And you can get the singles if you're just interested in the A-sides. Get the triple disc version of Nothing Has Changed, and then if you don't like the last 5 songs on there, you know you aren't going to like the rest of it. If you're into the vinyl editions, go back and buy the original versions. So go and buy this, Don't Be Fooled by the Name, and buy the Images compilation, and that should cover most of it. But there is a couple of things which happened later on. David went back, and as I've said before, he recorded a lot of those songs for the Toy album, which hit the internet in MP3 form in 2011. And here is a bootleg LP of Toy. Now, Toy is a great lost album. I think it's absolutely fascinating, actually. Very few artists do this. Kraftwerk did it with the mix, but hardly anybody else has done it. And nobody else has gone back to the early lost obscure songs from their very first album, their first EPs, and went, I'm going to re-record those as an adult. You know, REM did it a couple of times with a couple of songs. Kraftwerk did it with a mix. David Bowie did it with Toy. Hardly anybody else has gone back and went, how do those songs sound 30 years on? And the songs that are on Toy, a number of them were released on the B-sides that went alongside the Heathen album. And the story around Toy is for probably about 25 episodes in the future when I'm talking about David Bowie in the year 2000, Glastonbury, the Hours album, and so on and so forth. But effectively, Toy is an album that he recorded that wasn't able to be released at the time it was recorded, and he then superseded it with an updated version of Toy, which was released as Heathen, and Heathen has a number of songs which he recorded. So Toy is a mixture of old and new songs. It's got Uncle Floyd and Afraid on it, which are released on Heathen under slightly different names, and the old songs which he'd re-recorded in the year 2000 are not on here. However, they are on B-sides. This comes from, and if you're into David Bowie, then you'll know, there was a box set that was released in 2005 which had 2 CD editions of all of his albums, from Outside all the way up to Hours and Reality. So it's got Outside, Earthlink, it's got Hours on there, it's got Heathen, which I've taken out, and it's got the Reality, the last album of his touring years. Now, if you're going to buy the box set, the reason to buy the box set is because each album on the box set has a second CD, which is just chock full of B-sides. Sometimes they're useless crap remixes, and sometimes they're not. So, for example, on the second CD of Heathen, I've picked out the first CD by mistake. I knew that was too slick for this. But if you pick out the second CD of Heathen, again, the track details are only printed on the disc. But this has When the Boys Come Marching Home, Baby Loves That Way, You've Got a Habit of Leaving, and Shadow Man. So it's got a number of re-recordings that he recorded for the Toy album and weren't released because Toy wasn't released. So Toy effectively served as almost like the bedrock of the B-sides for the Heathen album. But to be honest, it's easier just to find them all on YouTube. So David Bowie's early years, you can really see him growing into who he's going to become. So on the first single there, Liza Jane, he doesn't sound anything like the guy he's going to become. Absolutely, there's no way you could listen to Liza Jane or I Pity the Fool and think, yep, he's going to turn into that guy. And it's pretty surprising to find that. He's re-recorded, let's say, Baby Loves That Way, and then puts it on the on the Toy album. And by the way, the re-recording is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Or You've Got a Habit of Leaving, or Can't Help Thinking About Me. You just wouldn't expect those songs at all, and somehow they're better being sung by an older guy who's got more experience, more money, a bigger band, and has had the opportunity to think about those songs for the past 30 years and go, well, what would I change? What would I do differently? And it's fascinating to hear. So I don't know where I'm going with this. I am going to be doing episodes where I talk about the rest of David Bowie's albums and the rest of his career. But I thought what I'd do is I'd shed some light on probably a pretty much unknown period of David Bowie's career to start off with. So early on, it's an essential purchase if you want to understand and listen to and have all the early David Bowie material. Since its release, there's a number of songs on there. There's 3 new songs that are on there, which I think are I'll Follow You, Glad I've Got Nobody, and I think there's another one as well. And there's also That's Where My Heart Is, I Want My Baby Back, and Bars of the County Jail, were songs that David, I don't think, was particularly pleased about have been released. He wasn't the kind of person that said he should release absolutely everything he ever recorded. And so he's bought up the copyrights to those. They will probably never repress this, to be honest, or for all I know, they'll announce next week that they're going to do it for a Record Store Day coloured vinyl edition as a double album with 10 unreleased songs on, because that's how the estate works, right? But no, early on is absolutely essential, and that is the best and easiest way to get hold of all his really, really early material. And if you want the first album, get the double CD version of David Bowie with the mono and the stereo mix and the 25 extra tracks on. And if that isn't enough for you, this is a fantastic compilation that details his radio sessions with the BBC in his early years, all the way up to, I think, 1973 or so. Next time I talk about David Bowie, I'm going to be talking about the Space Oddity album from 1969. And again, that's an album I have no living memory of because I wasn't even born when it came out. But that's not really the point. You know, these songs, when they're released, they don't belong to David Bowie anymore. They belong to everybody. You know, they're in the air and they become the people's songs. And the meaning that matters is the meaning that people ascribe to them. And there are fantastic songs on Space Oddity, but I'm going to talk about that when I can be bothered. Hopefully that's been an okay kind of unravelling of how complicated David Bowie's early discography has been. He was jumping from band to band to band, very, very ambitious, clearly moving, constantly leapfrogging from station to station to station to find out, where can I be a hit? How can I make this viable? How can I make enough money to survive? How can I make a career out of being a singer? And how can I make a career out of being creative? Because that was very much the thing that he wanted. And he was clearly, desperate and ambitious. He went through a number of bands. He had, was it the Conrads, the King Bees, the Hype, the Manish Boys, the Lower Third, Feathers. All of these bands were all him on his way to becoming himself. And, isn't that a beautiful thing? As he said, one of his great quotes was, the great thing about growing old is you finally become what you always might have been. And what a wonderful way to look at getting old. It's a beautiful thing, actually, is to be old. And I say, oh, well, maybe it isn't actually. But there are many things about it that are much, much better than not being old, I think. I've diverged, haven't I? I've talked myself into a corner and I can't think of an ending. So next time round, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be talking about. Might be The Wedding Present, might be U2, might be Depeche Mode or The Cure or New Order or anything. Might be Stanley Kubrick movies. I have no idea yet. I'm sure it'll come to me pretty soon. And in the meantime, I'll post some links down there to various ancient David Bowie archivey things. Thank you for spending 3/4 of an hour with me, listening to me talk about a dead bloke. Because obviously, as I've said before, what the world needs is more of middle-aged men talking about dead singers, because there isn't enough of that going on in the world. And I will see you all again some other time. Thank you, and stay tuned. Bye.